Hello everyone, it's Crystal. Thank you for joining me for part 7 of the Library Quilt-Along. In this video, I will show you about attaching labels to your quilt. I believe every quilt should have a label. When we are gone from this earth, people will want to know what the quilt story is. So I will show you how to attach a label. I will show you your options for designing and creating your labels. And also, I will show you how to attach a sleeve, how to calculate the dimensions for your sleeve, how to create your sleeve, and how to attach it to your quilt. Sleeves are optional. I'm going to hang my quilt. I'm not going to hang it by the sleeve, but I like to have the sleeve on my quilts that I hang just to have options for the future. If you ever want to submit your quilt to a quilt show or a competition, you will need a sleeve on that quilt. So just to make it easy for myself, every quilt that I will potentially hang, I add a sleeve. So if you have any questions about this quilt along or adding a sleeve or creating a label, feel free to contact me. Remember to share your progress about the quilt along on Instagram and use the hashtag Library Quilt QAL. Once again, the hashtag is Library Quilt QAL. I appreciate you joining me on this journey. I hope you have fun creating your own quilt without a pattern, and I look forward to seeing all that you do for this quilt along and in the future. Thank you. When it's time to label your quilt, you have a few options. You can always buy a custom label. If you did a Google search of buy custom quilt labels or custom quilt labels, you'll have a lot of options to choose from. But I'm going to show you 3 other options. The first is using fabric markers and a piece of fabric. This is a white cotton 10-inch square. You would take your square, or it could be any size square, but this gives you a good amount of space to work with. So you take your 10-inch square and you fold it on the diagonal. So you would take your fabric marker or your fabric pen, something that's permanent, and you would write information about the quilt in this area. You would put the name of the quilt, your name as the quilter, any other important information that you want to add. Make sure you include the date. And you would, this in here, the raw edges would go into the corner of your quilt. So you would add this label at the same time you're adding your binding. So whatever information you want to add, this is a 10-inch square, so this tells you how much space you have. So it doesn't have to be 10 inches, it could be even bigger. You can do a rectangle and you can actually hand sew your label onto the back of your quilt with a simple whip stitch. You have a lot of options, but the important thing is if you include a label, make sure you include your name and the date. If it's a gift, the person who's receiving the gift, that's important. And fabric markers or some other permanent marking tool. Another option, this second option that I use for my charity quilts. I mentioned previously in my sewing room tour that I have a charity project that I do. It's called Quilts for Little Angels. And I make baby quilts and donate them. So I bought these inkjet fabric sheets and I set them up like the Avery labels, 6 per sheet. And I printed these in my inkjet printer. It says Quilts for Little Angels. And then there's a scripture. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. That comes from John 13:35, and that's the New International Version. So I print them, 6 per sheet, and there's a paper backing on it. So when it's time to attach it to my quilt, my charity quilt, I actually place these in the middle of the back of my charity quilt. So I take off this paper backing, and then I add Heat and Bond Light to this just to make sure that it stays. There is adhesive on the back, but I just give it some, to make sure it's actually secure. I add Heat and Bond Light. So I press it to my quilt back before I quilt it. So my backing fabric, I put this in the middle, Heat and Bond Light, press it on, and then I do a blanket stitch all around, so it shouldn't come off. And then when I'm quilting my baby quilt, since this is in the middle, some of my quilting on the quilt should cover this as well, just to make sure that's secure. So these inkjet fabric sheets, that's another way to label your quilts. If you have a lot, if you're going to do charity quilting and you want to make sure that something about you is on that quilt, this is a good way. I know a lot of quilters that do charity quilts and they like this method. So inkjet fabric sheets, they're 8.5 by 11. They come 10 in a pack. And since I do 6 per sheet, I can get 60 labels from one of these packs. And finally, the option I use for the quilts that I'm giving out for me and the quilts that I keep for myself, I embroider my labels. This is, I just took this out of the hoop. This is for the library quilt. I designed it in a program called Embrilliance Express. Embrilliance has a lot of different embroidery software programs, but the Express version is a free download. You can just Google Embrilliance, Embrilliance, and Express, and you can download this to your computer. And I just use it just for these labels, because I was using Embrilliance Express before I bought some inkjet, before I bought a embroidery designs program. So I still use it. I had already set up my template, so if it works, keep working it, right? So there's no need for me to change. So if you are inclined and you have an embroidery machine, feel free to set up a template. Only thing I change is the name of the quilt and the date. So this template is set up already. I have it saved in my computer, and I take a thumb drive from my laptop and I put it into my embroidery machine. And I'm going to trim this down. And once I trim it down, I fold the top and I fold this side. And these raw edges are going to be in the binding of my quilt. I put this in the lower left-hand corner of the back of my quilt. I'm about to attach the binding. So if you want to do this method, you need to make your label before you attach your binding so this can go in. So I trim it down, fold these over and press these folds, and then I put Heat and Bond Ultra on the part of the quilt, the part of the label that's not going to be in the binding. So I do about 3/4 of an inch from here to here, and then 3/4 of an inch from this edge to the fold. I measure that, and then I make sure I put the Heat and Bond Ultra on it. It's in the red pack. You can't sew through Heat and Bond Ultra, so you have to make sure that you leave this area that's going in the binding. Make sure this area does not have it, because you can break your needle if you try to sew through this. So those are 3 options for labeling your quilt. I strongly encourage you to label all the quilts you make so that people will know the story behind the quilt, and you can keep track of it, because if it comes to a point that you make a lot of quilts, you may not remember all the details. So that's something to think about. Before we create our quilt sleeve, we need to do some calculations. There are different methods to creating your sleeve, different ways that people make them, but here's the method that I use. I take the width of my quilt top and I subtract 2 inches. So my quilt is 60 inches wide, so I'm going to subtract 2 inches. So I need a piece of fabric that's 58 inches long, and then I do 10 inches wide, because we're going to fold this in half and put it into the binding. So we're going to lose, it's going to be a little less than 5 inches once we do that. So I need a strip that's 58 by 10. So I took some fat quarters. Fat quarters are 18 by 21 inches. And I took the fat quarters and cut 2 strips 18 by 10 for both fat quarters. So I had 3 strips 18 by 10, and then I sewed them together along the 10-inch side. So I have this. You can't see the whole strip, but I cut it down. This is 58 and this is 10. So now that I have my strip, I'm going to take the 2 short ends and I'm going to fold them over twice to get rid of the raw edge, and I'm going to press it. After I press it, I'm going to stitch here to make sure it stays closed. I'm going to do that for both ends. Then after I do that, I'm going to fold it in half and press it. I'm going to clip it to the top of my quilt back. I'm going to take these clips. I'm going to have the back of my quilt facing me, and I'm going to just attach this along the top of my quilt back. So when it's time to attach my binding, this will be sewn into the binding. So this makes sure that it's secure. So once again, my next step is to fold this over twice, the short end, to get rid of the raw edges. Fold it over twice, press it, and then sew this seam, sew this fold. Do it for both ends. Take it to the ironing board, press this in half this way. After I do that, I'll take it to my quilt and just clip it to the top of my quilt. So when I'm adding my binding, I will sew this into my binding. So that makes sure it's secure. So after I'm all done with my binding, I will take Heat and Bond Ultra again. I will cut it. This will probably be 4.5 once it's in the binding. So I'll cut 4.5 inches wide times however long my sleeve is. And then I cut it to the proper dimensions. Then I will take it to the ironing board and I will press the Heat and Bond light to my quilt, remove the paper, press my sleeve to the Heat and Bond light. And that's how I attach my sleeves. If you ever want to submit a quilt to a quilt show, you need to have a sleeve. So for every quilt that I make that's going to hang, I add the sleeve, even if I don't think I'll ever submit the quilt to a quilt show. It's better to do it now than try to do it later, because later you'll have to do it by hand because you've already quilted it, you've already bound it. So that's how I do my sleeve. Calculate how much you need. Do a 10-inch wide strip. Get rid of these raw edges here by folding and sewing the fold. Fold it in half and then clip it to the top of your quilt before you add your binding, so it will be sewn into the binding. After the binding is done, measure how much Heat and Bond Ultra you need. Take the Heat and Bond Ultra, iron it to the back of your quilt where this sleeve will be. Take the sleeve, take the paper off, put the sleeve on top of the Heat and Bond Ultra, and then press the sleeve to the Heat and Bond Ultra. You may need to add some extra heat because You're going to have to go through, this is 2 layers of fabric, and then the heat and bond. You need to make sure the heat and bond ultra is firmly attached to your quilt as well. So a sleeve is optional, a label is optional, but if you do want to add those things, these are just some techniques to help you along the way.